Hey, what's up, dum-dums? You don't know shit, so I'm here to tell you about shit. Welcome to Halloween History. This is the 1-minute edition. You can find the full-length version of these topics on my YouTube channel. Here we go. Today's the story of Jack-o'-lantern. Jack-o'-lantern was an Irish folktale about a guy who was so evil that the devil came up from hell all the way to earth just to bring the guy back with him. Jack was like, that's fine, let's go get a drink first. And the devil was like, absolutely. So they start drinking, they get drunk, it's time to pay the bill, and the devil's like, I don't have any money. I'm not from here, and you guys made it up. Jack comes up with a scheme. He's like, hey, you're the devil. You're fucking magical and shit. Turn yourself into a coin, I'll pay the bar tab with it, and then afterward, you can drag me to hell. So the devil turns himself into a coin, and then Jack steals the coin. He doesn't pay the bill. He puts it in his pocket, and he walks out of the tab. He has a crucifix in his pocket. That crucifix keeps the devil trapped in the coin. So the devil's like, hey, let me out. Jack's like, I'll let you out under one condition. I don't want to go to hell. And I know I'm going to hell. So the devil agrees. Jack removes the cross, lets the devil out. Many years later, Jack finally dies because, of course he does, because all the worst people live forever. So then he gets sent to hell. And immediately the devil sees him and he's like, no, get out. Jack's like, absolutely. And as he looks out, he sees the empty void of darkness and nothingness that is between the planes of existence and realizes that he won't be able to see. So he turns to the devil and he says, hey, I need a light. And he scoops up an ember for the bowels of hell and then puts it inside a turnip. They used turnips back then. And then Jack is forced to wander the eternal planes of nothingness. Once in the New World, it became common practice to set a jack-o'-lantern outside your house to ward off evil spirits. Because if evil spirits are wandering around your neighborhood, they're going to see jack-o'-lantern hanging out in front of your house, and they go, don't mess with those people. They hang out with the dude who got kicked out of hell. The moral of the story is be so evil that you can't even get into hell. Now that you've seen the abridged version of the jack-o'-lantern story, we're going to dive a little more into jack-o'-lanterns as a part of Halloween culture. Creating things out of metal was expensive, so unless you were a blacksmith or someone who was wealthy enough to afford some kind of metal lantern, it was pretty common for rural folk or anyone who didn't have a lot of money to go find a piece of round fruit that could hold together, and then you put a light inside of that, and you could carry that around at night. So the premise of the idea of someone having something like a pumpkin with a light in it was actually pretty normal, and you would need something to project that light, so you would have to cut holes in it. And once in the New World, you could make larger lanterns with pumpkins, which leads us into how the jack-o'-lantern became so famous in the first place, which comes from Nathaniel Hawthorne's use of the phrase jack-o'-lantern in his short stories from the 1800s, as well as Irving Washington's Sleepy Hollow. Ichabod Crane is chased by a headless horseman who is carrying none other than a jack-o'-lantern. Another thing to take into account, that when it came to the English or the Irish, it was common to refer to someone you didn't know as Jack. Many night watchmen would be holding lanterns and standing guard, and when someone would see them, they'd refer to him as Jack. So a common phrase at the time was Jack of the Lantern. And if you turn that a little bit Irish, turns into Jack-o'-lantern. Isn't that fun? Once pumpkins were used this way in the New World, combined with what is now considered to be the first American horror story, it became common practice to leave jack-o'-lanterns outside your house to ward off the evil spirits, just like the ancient Celts. And then, of course, with trick-or-treating and Halloween parties, it just became part of our culture, to the point where you really wouldn't even think about it that much now. Anyway, that's the story of jack-o'-lantern. Today, we're talking about witches. Witches have been around, of course, for thousands of years, but the witches that we think of today come from a very specific time, and that, of course, is medieval Europe. You see, back then, if you were even slightly different, everybody blamed everything on you and wanted to kill you, just like today. So, of course, if you know that everyone's out to get you, you probably want to move, I don't know, somewhere like into the woods, famously known as where witches would live. But they were literally just eccentric women who were trying to get away from society. Anything back then could get you labeled a witch, from mental illness to not going to church enough. That'll get you killed. And especially if you were a woman, since it was almost always exclusively women. Some of the myths about witches come from the dumbest fucking places. For example, the things that were known as the tools of witches were literally just common household objects. Witches kept cats around because they ate mice. A cauldron back then was in every household. It was basically just a stove. And your broom was a fucking broom. It would be the equivalent today of someone saying that your eccentric aunt is a witch because she has a cat and has a microwave and uses a Swiffer. Witch trials happened all the time throughout medieval Europe and carried over on into the New World. The Salem witch trials literally just happened because a little girl was like, yeah, the lady's a witch, and everybody was like, oh, no shit. And they rounded up a bunch of people and killed them. Turns out it was just mass hysteria like the Satanic Panic and every other dumb fucking thing that everybody's ever done. Anyway, the moral of the story is don't blame everything on supernatural causes, don't be a fucking asshole, and mind your fucking business. Now we can dive into witches. Just like my dating life. Fuck. When we think of Halloween, we are specifically thinking of the medieval persecution of mostly women. There were a few men that were rounded up, but they were usually collateral damage because they were seen to have been working with their wives or some woman they knew. The witch trials of Middle Ages Europe are not too dissimilar to pretty much every time they rounded up a group of people. It was basically an extension of blame the Jews. Black Plague came through, they blamed the Jews and then burned down all their houses, that sort of thing. And then the justification for that was the same thing they say about witches. Basically, the history of Middle Ages Europe, if you have a group of people that you want to kind of get out of your way, just say that they eat babies, drink blood, and worship the devil. This tactic still works today. It's going on right now. I haven't seen a whole lot of research about this, but I'm going to guess that some of the more modern depictions of witches with giant noses and little warts on them kind of look like other drawings, and I think you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, I googled it. I was right. And if you're like, oh, you're being woke about this, no, I'm not. It wasn't even considered faux pas to be like, yeah, Two-Face, gonna have to bleep that. Isn't it fun? You can be on the right side of an issue and still have to bleep it. Anyway, going into the 19th and 20th century, we started to make witches sexier and trying to make things more provocative based. And now you got a bunch of white girls who tell you they can put a curse on you or whatever. They're pretty cool most of the time. When you really dive into what witchcraft is, basically it's do what thou will, but do no harm. which in my estimation is one of the best things that you can say to someone if you're trying to have them practice any kind of spiritual belief. And that would be the ultimate irony, right? The group of people whose main tenet is to mind your business minded their business and still were persecuted. So try not to be a dick. Today we are talking about zombies. The origins of zombies come from West African culture, so it shouldn't be a huge shock to figure out how it got to the Western world. Slaves came from West Africa. Part of the original zombie lore was a way to keep people from killing themselves. There was a superstition among the slaves that if you killed yourself, you would then be forced to stay a zombie working the fields forever. Side note, Suicide Zombies, super fucking cool punk rock name. Zombies weren't always the Walking Dead. In fact, they were always alive. The original zombification of a person was when a voodoo priest would approach a subject and then blow a powder in their face, which would disorient them or make them paralyzed. No, it wasn't cocaine. That would have the opposite effect. However, great plot point for an American horror movie. The powder was often made of crushed up herbs, shells, and animal bones. And the idea was once you breathed in the powder, you would then be amenable for coercion. There was also a cocktail of this powder that could then make someone paralyzed, even slow down their heartbeat to the point where it seemed as though they were dead. And of course, most frighteningly, people being buried alive and then trying to claw their way out. And the other aspect of this would be that when people were zombified, they walked around as if they were dead because their brain function had stopped. Several authors had written about voodoo and zombification in the West, but not many people knew about it until White Zombie came out. No, not the Rob Zombie band, the film White Zombie from 1932. But it wasn't until 1968 when George Romero came out with Night of the Living Dead that we got the modern day zombie. There's even a group of people who are preparing for the zombie apocalypse as if that's somehow going to be a thing. There's plenty of different ways we're going to end society. I don't think zombie apocalypse is going to be one of them. Guns run out of bullets, bats and swords never do until you lose your arms. Anyway, moral of the story is colonialism's bad, zombies aren't real, and go watch some more of my fucking videos. Today we were talking about ghosts. Ghosts have been around, of course, since the first people died, and then more people were like, what happened to them? They were like, they're fucking floating around somewhere or something. But for the purposes of Halloween history, we're going to focus on the ghosts and the white bed sheet. Where'd the white bed sheet come from? Back in the day, whenever anybody died, they would cover them in a white sheet so everybody didn't have to look at them. They would shroud them from the public. A shroud. And the thought process was that if the spirit ever came back to life, it would lift up the sheet and then float around with it on its head or something. But the true roots of the American ghost story is a direct result of the American Civil War. It cannot be understated the size, scope, and scale of loss. It would be the equivalent today of about 6 million Americans. So many soldiers' bodies were left unclaimed and left out on the battlefield, and the families never got any closure. So they began to tell stories about their spirits coming home again. With so much loss of life and so many people left to grieve, many Americans reached out for new ways to try and contact their lost loved ones. This created an explosion of spiritualism in the 19th century in America. However, since the majority of Americans were Christian, they had to find a way to justify bringing spiritualism into their Christian practices. So it became commonplace for Christians to use psychics, Ouija boards, and get palm readings. All of these things were accepted at the time. With the explosion of print media, radio, and film, these stories permeated the culture and created what we now know today as the modern ghost story. Moral of the story is ghosts aren't real, Civil War is, and let's try to not have another one. Talking about trick-or-treating. Like everything Halloween related, the history of trick-or-treating goes all the way back to the Celts. During the festivals, saw when the ancient Celts would leave out meals and treats for the souls of those they had recently lost, but also to ward off evil spirits. They figured they could appease them with snacks. If only someone had told them that in The Exorcist. Could you imagine that? The father just walks in, the girl's like, your mother sucks in hell. And then he's just like, here, have a cookie. Similar practices were adopted by Roman pagans who would pour milk on graves and leave them sweet little treats. In medieval times, the church came up with this usual grifting bullshit where they told people if you prayed hard enough, you could get the souls of your loved ones out of purgatory and into heaven. So the poor and impoverished children of Europe would go around telling people that they would pray for the souls of their loved ones if you gave them a little treat. This would be the first thing that would kind of resemble the Halloween that we have now. Once we got into the 18th century, this transformed into something more akin to what you would think of when you think of Christmas, where people would go and show up to houses and sing a carol, but during Halloween times, they would show up and do a little play. It was like caroling, except for somebody looked like Satan and somebody looked like a regular dude, and then they'd stand outside your house and be like, I'm gonna eat your soul, and one guy would be like, I love God, and they'd be like, great, here's some cookies. A lot of cookies. These traditions were brought over to the New World. The only difference here was that some people decided that they would perform small tricks, something that might resemble like illusions or magic tricks. Over time, this began to morph into more of a casual threat. A lot of 18th and 19th century has a lot of people being threatened for food. But there's no class struggle in this country. It's almost like crime comes from somewhere. During the 19th century, this was done on a small scale in mostly rural communities, but as the popularity of the holiday grew and more people started to come over from Europe, and with the poverty of the Great Depression setting in, things began to transform from trick-or-treat to pretty much just tricking. Let me say that different. People stopped asking for treats and just started fucking shit up. Things got so bad at one point that during the 1930s, someone came up with an estimate of somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars of damage done every Halloween. If you converted like 1920s money into today's money, that's a load of money. It wasn't like what you think of today when you think of vandalizing. It wasn't like, oh yeah, egg someone's house and like toilet paper them. They were setting buildings on fire. They would deconstruct wagons on people's property and then reconstruct it on the roof of their barn and then leave. So you'd go out to go do some work in the morning and be like, where's my wagon? And you'd be like, oh, it's on the roof. And then you'd have to go up there and take it apart or just push it off. They would also do stuff like let livestock out. They would go to people's farms and just like open the gates. They would do this so much. In some more rural areas, they actually called it gate night. For a while during the peak of vandalism and destruction, people even started to call it hell night, which I think we can all agree is pretty fucking metal. They knew something had to be done, and that's when community organizers, politicians, and others started to get together and go, we need to find a way to reel these people in. How do we get the children to stop? And that's when they came up with trick-or-treating and Halloween parties. And it worked. They were like, if we just throw these kids a party and give them enough candy, they'll just sugar crash and stop. The story of trick-or-treating is literally just bribing kids and teenagers to stop breaking everything. Anyway, the moral of the story is don't sell out, be ungovernable. Today we are talking about costumes. Costumes runs pretty parallel to trick-or-treating, so go ahead and watch that video if you haven't already. Costumes first began with the ancient Celts who would dress up as a way to avoid their dead loved ones who they didn't want to see, and to avoid evil spirits like death trying to drag you into the afterlife. The Romans would wear costumes for fall festival parties. The thing that would most closely resemble what we know as today's Halloween costume would be when people used to go around door to door doing plays for treat. Once trick-or-treating took hold and vandalism became a part of it, people started to wear costumes as a way of not being recognized as the person who probably broke her shit. In the 1930s and 40s, when people began to tame Halloween a little bit, that's when people realized they could make some money off of costumes. Only problem was the first companies to try and make any money off of costumes decided to use paper. This caused a problem as hundreds of kids across the country started to catch fire because everybody was wearing paper costumes, which means kids were going to school the next day and they were like, oh, what happened at the party? 7 kids caught fire, but the candy was pretty good, full-size candy bars. One of the biggest contributions to the idea of wearing a mask was when Guy Fawkes tried to blow up Parliament in the early 1600s. It's the mask you would know from V for Vendetta. He wasn't able to pull it off. When they caught him, he was drawn and quartered. Drawn and quartering was when they tie your hands and feet to 4 horses and have them run in opposite directions, tearing your body apart in 4 ways. Anyway, moral of the story is if you want to do some bad shit, make sure you wear a mask, and if you're going to wear a mask, make sure you pull off the job, and if you don't pull off the job, make sure you don't get caught, otherwise you get torn in half by horses. Hope you learned something. If you didn't, that's fine too. Nothing matters. Who gives a fuck? That's it. Get fucked.
Happy Halloween!